Hi, and welcome to Making Waves on Purpose. Today I'm joined by Jill Dumain. Jill and I are partners together in Fractal CSOs, as we are with Chad and Lena and Jim. And Jill and I have a fascinating discussion around a wide range of issues. She was at Patagonia, SGS, Blue Sign, so she's inhabited a number of roles in this space, came up through products and textiles, and so was in the business before she took over the sustainability roles. So she has that really interesting mix of a dedication to sustainability, but also a product or services mindset as well. So it's a really interesting kind of inside out, outside in conversation that I think is pervading much of the space right now is this kind of how do you square the circle between business value, societal value, and manage the trade-offs or sometimes competing goals. Fascinating discussion, really great person to be connected to, and I'm delighted to be a partner with her and the others. And I know you'll enjoy this conversation. Thanks all. Jill, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Jeff.
So tell us, what are you up to these days? Tell everybody a little bit of your career path and where you are now.
With pleasure. My career path has been full of twists and turns and have enjoyed a long, long career in sustainability at this point. And I always laugh when students ask me, well, how did you get here? It's like, it's never the way you want to hear it. But I started in textiles, was a textiles major at the University of California at Davis, and went straight to Patagonia's fabric lab doing quality control. So literally in a lab, testing fabrics, good, bad. But as a result of that, I really, really learned my craft. I really learned about fabrics, got to know our supply chain as a result of working through problems. And I go back to that initial role as so foundational of learning how to work through issues that are problems. They're not issues, they're problems, because when you have a quality control issue coming, something's wrong. So learning to work with people of different cultures as a very young woman with a lot of money on the line and trying to figure that out. And moving from that quality control into development, like that didn't work. Let's make something better. So working to improve our fabrics and then develop new ones, hopefully avoiding the problems. And then in the early 90s is when the sustainability work came to Patagonia. And I was in the fabric area. And that's where a lot of our innovations were coming at the fiber level, whether it was organic agriculture or recycled synthetics, finding new fibers for us, new old fibers like hemp that had lower growing profiles. So as a result of following my passion of textiles and quality and that creative path, ended up on this sustainability path in the early 90s. So fast forward 30 years later and have had some pretty interesting components to my career, from product, supply chain, international development, environmental strategies for a global company, growing company like Patagonia, hopping over the ocean to be CEO of Blue Sign Technologies, which again utilized my network and my ability to think of how best to work with people of other cultures, whether it was my newly Swiss European colleagues or our very heavily Asian-based customers, and now into Fractal CSOs of trying to wrap all that experience into an offering to the industry, of using that experience in a way that I think I bring some of the best value to the industry. As a practitioner for most of my career, I've had to sit in that seat of decision, had to sit in that seat of evaluation and make a decision or give advice to others. And that's what I'm hoping to work with clients now on, is how do you take everything that's out there in the world, distill it down to what's best for that company, and make good decisions from a business and sustainability standpoint.
I love the idea that, John Davies at GreenBiz has often said, and I really like this idea, that the chief sustainability officer role is a chief translation officer role. And I think that's quite right. But maybe using a different framing, it sounds to me like you're trying that sustainability for you is building bridges, is connecting dots between different parts of the company and different conversations.
Yeah, it's really astute because even from the early days with our supply chain at Patagonia, when we started to introduce some of these things that at the time were pretty nutty and pretty crazy, I had to figure out how to build bridges to our vendors. And when we said we wanted everything to be organic cotton, most of them asked, what is organic cotton? So figuring out how to bring the raw material to them, but more importantly, how to convince them it was worth it to do in their operations, which was not insignificant when you're thinking about spinning mills that literally run 365 days, 24 hours a day. 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. They don't stop. And so to stop and introduce a new raw material that can't be contaminated by all the requirements, it's a really significant thing. So it was building bridges to get them to see the importance, convince them it was worth trying. And then on the flip side, to the consumers, why is this important? Why did we go through all this trouble of finding new raw materials literally at the farm level and then pulling it through our supply chain?
It's interesting how the systems we operate, like until you really understand those systems, you can't really understand the complexity of the ask. I mean, it's a silly example, but I remember when I was starting out, one of the things I was focused on was, recycled content in our copiers. And this was at Sodexo and PwC. And, we used a lot of paper and blah, blah, blah. And we're like, okay, did the math. Like if we went to this is what it would cost us. This is what it would save in terms of trees and whatnot. And then we go to find out that none of the copy machines can handle more than, 23% recycled content paper because the fiber has some cut to it. And if you look at it microscopically, you can see it doesn't align. And I'm like, oh my God, really?
Exactly right. And this a similar example on a higher financial implication was our spinning mill in Thailand. Cotton has a lot of insects, a lot of insect pressure in the fields. And one thing that comes in are aphids. And aphids secrete a sticky substance. So there's a cotton that is every spinner's nightmare known as sticky cotton. And it's a result of a bug infestation at the field level that doesn't really present itself until you're in the spinning mill. And then it's a little bit like trying to comb your hair with bubble gum in it. So you've got this spinning mill, again, running 365 days a year. They were willing to do a small batch of cotton for us. And unbeknownst to everybody, it was sticky cotton. So in a normal, conventional way, you could dilute that. If you get a batch of sticky cotton, you put one bale per 50 and it's at a level, it's okay. When you only have sticky cotton, it's a big problem. So in Bangkok, which they have the hot season, the hotter season, and the hottest season, they had to turn their air conditioning up to a level to crystallize the sugar to get it out of the machine.
Really?
Talk about an unforeseen consequence of trying to do the right thing.
I mean, this is all about unintended consequences and why it's all so hard.
Exactly. So here was this whole journey of convincing the supply chain to do this, try this with us. And that was the first run. We didn't know about it. We had an amazing partner that we worked with there. We didn't know about it for a long time. And I remember sitting across the table as he was explaining it to me, just sinking lower and lower in my chair. But we figured it out, you learn from that. And that's one thing that I would say with all the work in sustainability is you're going to have issues, you're going to have problems because you're trying new things in very well-established supply chains. But I think the confidence you gain over the years is not knowing what the problem's going to be, but realizing you're going to figure out how to solve it.
A lot of it is about the relationships you've built with those people
100%
through that process. So it's clear that you had their shared success. Obviously you had goals that you wanted to meet,
right,
but you also wanted them to be successful in this so that it was a sustainable program and could change the industry ultimately, hopefully. You worked hard to align, it sounds like, incentives and everybody wanting the same thing.
Yep. Yeah. And I think a big part of that in the early years especially was we were willing to share our sources. we had competitors. I mean, it became very well known in the industry. We would share our sources with our competitors because, one, we weren't big enough to float a new supply chain of any of this environmental stuff on our own. Really, no company is. And so we needed the others to be successful. But then that was a real incentive to our supply chain. And, it was always fun for me when somebody kind of heard about it and they'd call and sort of, bite around the edges of trying to ask, who do you buy this from? Which, of course, is a line most competitors don't cross with each other. And I could say openly, yes, let me show you. Do you want me to send you swatches? I can give you the technical information. And so it was really a fun time to really shift the way the industry worked as well, to be able to do some of that.
I mean, it's interesting because as much as sustainability in some ways cuts against the core of the way that many people have developed their thinking around how businesses should operate, and that, sustainability should be, governmental regulated, like that this isn't something that needs to be done voluntary, I think is not is not uncommon response. More importantly, you're also cutting against the grain with this idea of pre-competitive, partnerships. And I think that one might be even more difficult to overcome. Talk a little bit about how that was received and the thinking behind it. I mean, and is that replicable? Because the problem with Patagonia, I love the examples. And I love the fact that Patagonia is one of the shining cities on the hill for us in the sustainability. The question is how much of it is replicable?
So I would agree. I feel like we helped to set that tone at the beginning, but it wasn't just Patagonia. And at the beginning of a lot of this work, which is now back to between 90 and 95, let's say in that time period, you kind of knew who your competitors were, but not really. There wasn't a lot of mechanism in the industry to even know who they were. Some of the conferences that we take for granted today, they didn't exist back then, especially in the realm of sustainability. And the only place you saw your competitors were at trade shows, which is 100% commercial activity, right? One thing that was interesting about Patagonia is we sat at the nexus of this work starting to happen in the sustainability part of textiles, which did not include at the beginning our outdoor competitors. But we also sat in the outdoor industry, where literally everybody in the outdoor industry sat around campfires with each other, right? And so people in this personal way differently than just at a trade show competing. So I think we were at this interesting nexus point between those two things. We got to know companies in the fashion and the athletic wear area, kind of in the sustainability. Nike was a really big player. Gap was doing a lot of work then. So we got to know people in a very different part of our outdoor industry. And then as that evolved and developed, the outdoor industry started to say, hey, we got to protect nature. I mean, this is our business, period. If nature doesn't exist, our products don't matter. So then that lit the fire in the outdoor industry, which became the genesis of the Higg Index and all these evaluation tools that are out there, a product that we put together as a industry called the Eco Index. And that was evolving in the outdoor industry, led by a group of people that were super passionate around it. And then at the same time, the Walmarts of the world were starting to say, hey, we need to do something. And my boss at the time, Rick Ridgway, was involved with Walmart and Yvon Chouinard. I mean, Walmart came to Patagonia and say, what do you guys do? How can we do something? And they started evolving this idea of the index, and sitting 2 feet away from Rick, I was like, hey, there's this going on in the outdoor industry too. Let's not compete. Let's figure out a way to bring these two together. And so the work that had happened that was really led a lot by REI and Timberland and Patagonia and MEC, others I'm sure I'm forgetting. Then it became my job to go to the trade shows and talk to the association leaders, CEOs, to say, hey, this is on the table. We can either work with them or work alongside. But I think working together is going to be a lot smarter. They're a lot bigger. They have a lot more money than we do. And so that was the beginning of bringing those things together that eventually became the Higg Index. And Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which is just rebranded, I don't know how to say it, Cascale or Cascal, was a mix of fashion and outdoor, because it was really this blending at the beginning and choosing to work together rather than in competition, even developing the evaluation tools.
I mean, I'm fascinated by this because I'm wondering, like, how much of this is because it's a consumer facing product that is quite intimate in some ways. Like,
Right.
your
Right.
relationship with your clothes is different than your relationship with pens and pencils and computers and whatever. And so it's got that. You've also got some names in there who, Yvonne, Rick Ridgway, like many of the people listening to this won't know, their backgrounds, but these guys are climbers that
Right.
came up. And Rick, in fact, went on to do some amazing stuff in the Himalayas. And you've got Doug Tompkins, who then, buys huge pieces of Patagonia, literally the place, not the organization. How much of that was because of the people? How much of that is, and what lessons were you then able to take from that to forward in your role at Bluesign and others, like in helping leaders and CSOs to kind of learn the lessons of making change?
So two things come to mind spontaneously as you were just saying that. The first one is to be authentic, because it's really easy to get on a bandwagon and not necessarily for the right reasons. And I watched a lot of people, I would say early years in the 90s, around sustainability, start to see some of the price points because they were expensive. It wasn't a light undertaking when you were choosing to do recycled paper or organic cotton. I mean, the price differential was huge. So there were people in industry who started to see that and jump on because of that, and not really realizing how difficult it was. So there was a lot of that, and that it wasn't an authentic approach in terms of I'm doing this for these reasons. The other one is communication and learning how to not only get people to understand it, but want to understand it. And that distinction I make in there is, if they want to understand it, then their brain keeps going to figure out the next steps wherever you are. If you've done 1, 2, 3, they're going to help you on 4, 5, 6. And Patagonia as a company, but both Yvonne Chenard and Rick Ridgway are quintessential storytellers. And they can tell a story like no other. And I think I was really fortunate to learn from them on some of that translation piece. And I think I've distilled it down to that, not only understand, but want them to understand. And I think that has guided me well over time, because it's finding those points of connection that aren't necessarily obvious at the beginning, but what's going to trigger in the person you're in this business negotiation with the desire to see this successful. And so I think I'm off track a lot from where we started on this comment. But, I think back to when I was this young woman working with Japanese suppliers or Chinese suppliers. And I grew up in suburban Orange County in California. And these were self-made business people that built from the scratch a textile mill in Hong Kong. So there wasn't a lot of background, but we had to find these points of connection going forward. And then everybody ends up on a similar road. I won't say the same road, but or at least a similar goal. And you might have different pathways to get there, but I think it's also allowing people to find their way. So this goes back to the authenticity. It's allowing people to show up how they can and not forcing them into kind of what's used a lot in this colonial, we know best because we're from the West kind of mantra. And I think one thing, being young, doing a lot of this, I didn't show up with a lot of experience. So I had to trust them. I had to engage them and learn from their experiences as well. I couldn't show up with the answers because I didn't have them. And so showing up in that sort of authentic way early on, figuring out how to get to the same goal that we now shared, and then learning how to communicate it, I think is really important.
That's fascinating. It never occurred to me that one of the skills that Tompkins and Chenard and Ridgway and others had developed through their adventures was the appreciation of different cultures, the skills to engage in those cultures. And those cultures are not only East-West, they're also rich-poor. Even as much as these guys were probably, dirtbag climbers, they're rolling up with gear that most of these people that they're, supporting their trips couldn't afford. And so there still is at that point, they weren't the most affluent, but there was still an economic divide. That's fascinating that we're talking about building bridges between ideological differences, between identity differences, between different value systems, not only within the companies, but within the supplier set and the people who support it. I love this idea of like storytelling as a means of driving connection and building bridges and shared goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that was two things interesting for me, a lot of my vendors when I first started were both in the US and in Japan. And as a 23-year-old woman, I was working with middle-aged men. So there's a whole nother dynamic as well, especially with some of the cultures that, well, both of them, neither of them had women in their cultures. The textile mill in the US at that point or Japan. Those were my two main markets. And so you bring that component in as well. But I think of the building of the cultures.
Mm-hmm. The appreciation of different cultures. So tell me, then you worked in an entirely different space in Switzerland with, in a different role. You were CEO. Tell us a little bit about that and lessons learned there. Because I would imagine that was a little more, you had a CEO at Patagonia who was bringing you ideas. And then you kind of reverse that where you all are bringing ideas to the CEOs, right?
Right. My work with different cultures served me very well going to BlueSign. And the thing about Switzerland is there's similarities to the US, of course, and there's differences. The work culture is more similar to the US because they're not a socialized government like their neighbors. And so Switzerland is more similar to the US in some of the work components. So that was familiar to me. And then also the network, it was right in my lane in terms of a network. So that was great. My predecessor at BlueSign was a male Swiss scientist type personality. So when I blow in from California as a female from a brand, it was a little bit like, whoa, what's going on here? And I didn't know a lot of people. And of course, it couldn't be announced during the search. And so it was a surprise. And I knew a handful of people, and that was really great. And I think some of them were still wow, a brand person coming in. But then people that I knew there, one of them came up to me and said, I'm glad they hired somebody with values because that's what this company needs. And so there was this dichotomy. And where I was in Switzerland, it was quite common in my generation for women, once they had children, to not continue to work at 100%. And so a lot of the women were at part-time positions, and therefore they prioritized their families, which is fantastic and choice. But I didn't have a lot of female peers in BlueSign and the surrounding area. When I went to hire people for my executive team, I rarely got any submissions from women because it just wasn't there. So when I go back to my 23-year-old self of working with men of a different culture, it served me well because now I'm working with men of a different culture. And at BlueSign, I think we had 16 native tongues among our employees. And so it was a really diverse out of 80 employees. So not a huge staff, but super diverse. And we had employees in a lot of the production countries. So we had main offices in Hong Kong and Taiwan and China, but then we had individuals in India and Korea and Japan and Guatemala and all these different areas where production was happening, where our clients were. So it was really an interesting combination, both internally and externally, to think about how I arrived and what I wanted to see achieved there. And I think one of the things that was most satisfying to me in my career was empowering my colleagues. And at Patagonia, there was one project we did called the Footprint Chronicles. And a super great unintended consequence of that project was the team that worked on that became so empowered in what they thought they could achieve in parts of their job that weren't related to that project, but suddenly they were empowered around sustainability, empowered around change. And that was the same thing I think that I brought to Bluesign, especially for the younger generation there, of being very open with my ideas, being very inclusive in meetings where, I would ask employees to present the work they did. I didn't do it. That was really empowering for them and trusting them in their roles. And there was one woman, she was fairly new and she was in an audit position and she was going to Japan to do one. And, I mentioned a few minutes ago, some of our vendors in the 90s didn't really engage with our sustainability efforts. And there was one in particular who kept saying to me, "Oh, you're still doing that sustainability stuff, huh?" And I said, "Yeah, one day, you're going to end up here. One day, do it now. It'll be easier than if you wait 10 more years." So we always kind of had this rapport and joke going back and forth. So this new employee is going on an audit in Japan. And I get a note from this executive that he's going to attend the audit. I said, "Finally, your sustainability education is about to take leaps and bounds." So I went to this woman and I told her that. Well, I didn't want her to be surprised, but now she's got the weight of her CEO knowing the executive who's watching her for 3 days. And she's fairly new. And the client was there as well, which is not always a situation. So she walked in with a lot of pressure, but it's like, you got it. You're smart. You know what you're doing. And 100% trust. Like, I didn't think of sending anybody else with her. So we were all, waiting afterwards. And then we were at a big trade show and I got an email from this executive at this Japanese company. And he said, "Jill, I went to your audit and my colleagues think I'm like Patty Hearst and I was kidnapped and brainwashed because now I get it. Now I want to work on the sustainability stuff." And I went and I shared this with this woman. And we both kind of teared up of like, wow, this is why we do what we do, to see change, even if somebody's been in the industry for 40 years. And it was a really big milestone for me because it showed she was really empowered in her role after that. It was trust that she could do her job. And so this whole idea of empowerment for me as a colleague, as a boss, as a leader is really important. And I've seen phenomenal things come after somebody truly feels empowered in their work.
No, I love that. And I'm going to say we leave it there. This idea of building bridges through storytelling, authenticity, and empowerment.
Yeah.
What could be, like huge lessons there. And I want to have you back because I want to talk about this idea of like we hired somebody with values, but we're also a company with, I think you said 16 or 18 different languages. Like, that's a lot of different value systems.
Yep.
How do you go through a process of negotiating and creating a sense of shared values within an organization that can unlock a lot of engagement that could otherwise? And I think that's especially important now as our identities are so affected by our ideologies, whether that's in America or US, China or US, Russia or what have you. So,
and I think just to finish on that note, it's allowing your employees to make some mistakes. And I've always seen myself as like the guardrail on a highway. And they might go straight and that's the most efficient, but they might bounce across the guardrails for a while. But that's okay. That's how they're going to learn to go straight.
And sometimes, bouncing around has its advantages too.
Absolutely.
Innovation comes from usually not a straight line.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure as always to talk to you.
Thank you. Talk again soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.